Landed on the Substance. I'm your host, Trevor Aiken.
And I'm your other host, Philip Marinello.
We're two guys who are thinking critically about faith, culture, and theology, and we are glad you've joined us today.
Hey, welcome.
Welcome to today's episode, indeed.
Thanks for listening.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks for giving us a try. Tell all your friends. If we're worth it, hey, we want to earn it. But we do want you to tell all your friends.
Yeah, and I think this will be a great episode today for interaction, to hear everyone's thoughts, which is really one of the main things that we are interested in here on The Substance.
What are we talking about today, Trev?
Today, I want to bring a topic talking about the Old Testament.
Okay.
Really look in the face some things that people at least accuse Christians of wanting to sweep under the rug, to not want to think about, to look the other way at, which is some of the moral questions that the world at large, especially people outside the church, really have about the Old Testament.
Sure.
Specifically, the two topics that come to my mind kind of right off the bat are the issue of the wholesale slaughter. Some people use the term ethnic cleansing. Some people use the term genocide that is advocated for Israel in the Old Testament. And then the other one that comes to mind that a lot of people have an issue with is the Old Testament's allowance of slavery in Israel. So I've been thinking about these things a lot. I'm going to be teaching about these things.
I think those
soon.
are probably the biggest ones. And I also wanted to add, I was talking with my wife on the way here.
Sure.
I think another one, and it kind of overlaps a little bit with both potentially, but just the severity of the application of the moral law. So like the severity of the penalties of falling short of the moral law.
So like, for example, when a kid disobeys his parents, God prescribes
stoning.
Let's go ahead and stone him.
Stoning could be appropriate in that scenario.
Okay.
Things like that.
Yeah, okay.
But they all kind of fall under the same, like the severe morality, potentially, of those things.
Yeah. So definitely, those are some of the things we're going to be talking about today. And listener, what are some of the things that you are thinking about? Like, we've just listed 3. Maybe there's others for you. We'd be happy to hear those, and we'll be putting some contact information at the end of the show. You can get in touch with us. Let's jump into the slaughter issue first off.
Okay.
There's when we talk about that, there's an Old Testament text.
Before we jump right into that,
Sure.
we did want to talk about just kind of setting the stage. Like, if you are a believer, we don't want to assume obviously everybody that's listening to this won't fall into that camp, but just set up the seeming, and in some people's minds the dichotomy between the Old and New Testament, and why this is even a question.
Yeah. So
because there are some people that obviously, like, we believe the Bible is God's word.
Yeah.
Not everybody believes that equally as far as old and new.
That's
and
true.
How the old is applied along with the new. Are they applied the same way? So, like, this is all kind of underlying before we, like, I feel like that's all kind of fundamental to some of the things we want to hit today.
I think we come from a faith tradition that believes that both Old and New Testament were divinely inspired. In other words, God wrote it using human agents. And it was the same God who wrote both the Old and New Testament, and so they hold the same truth value. They are both true, and they both represent a revelation of God to the world. And so,
agreed.
We believe that the New Testament and the authors of the New Testament and Jesus himself believed in the veracity of the Old Testament, trusted the Old Testament, looked to the Old Testament for moral guidance.
And in the New Testament, when Scripture is mentioned, that was the Old Testament.
Exactly. So
that seems, because full disclosure, I don't know what other episodes, depending on what we're going to cover in our kind of little BTS here behind the scenes. We haven't recorded our kind of like purpose statement episode. I don't know how much we're going to get in our personal backgrounds, but we do both have seminary training background. So we don't want to, I want to be careful not to assume that everybody's on the same page as far as both education and understanding or position on these things.
I absolutely agree. We want to make this as clear as possible. But I think some people, I mean, if you're not familiar with it, you could probably Google some of it and just see right away that there are people who have questions, especially about the Old Testament, and whether or not the things that God advocates there make him a moral monster.
Well, and the question of some people say, like, is the God of the old, like, is that the same guy that they're talking about?
Right, and you had people even in the...
Kind of, I don't mean to be sacrilegious.
Yeah,
but
no,
you
but
know
even
what
in the
I'm
first century, people were saying, like, hey, like, Jesus is God, or Jesus is one kind of God, or God the Father over Jesus is one kind of God, but God of the Old Testament, Yahweh, was a different God entirely. And so people will point out, well, in the New Testament with Jesus, you have forgiveness and you have mercy and you have kind of a more generous and merciful application of the law that focuses on heart things. But then in the Old Testament, you have the stuff we're talking about today. You have stoning and you have wholesale wiping out an entire town, men, women, and children. You have slavery. You have all these other kind of things. And
that
so,
are hard to, with a modern, like, kind of humanist-centered, like, approach, those two things don't seem to jive.
Exactly.
They don't. Spoiler.
Yeah, I mean,
it really is about, like, I feel like the heart of today, and I don't want to get too ahead of ourselves, but I really think that just at the outset, really the heart of it is, like, the lens that you're viewing them with. And, like, that's the most important thing. We're not going to be making apology for the Old Testament, but it's really, you need to come to it with the proper understanding, basically.
I think so. I think here's the thing. I think there are definitely some big misunderstandings that are very popular out there, and
Sure.
I think I want to address
kind
some
of anecdotal
of those.
arguments that sound good if you already discount the Old Testament.
But when you look at the actual text, you'll find a different picture. Now, I'm not saying you're going to agree with that picture either.
Sure.
But I think you'll probably, what it'll come down to is you don't agree that God has the authority to do X, Y, Z because either he doesn't exist, or if he does, you don't think that he ought to have the right to do X, Y, Z.
It's you disagree, or you don't believe, or
Right.
you disagree, versus
Right.
this doesn't jive.
But I think some of the things that are said about the Old Testament, and in my presentation I'm going to give on Sunday, I'm going to talk about Michael Pryor, who is a Catholic scholar. And he charges the Old Testament as being racist, xenophobic, and militaristic.
All the immoral accusations.
Those three things in particular: racism, xenophobia, and militarism. Because he brings them up multiple times. And I think you can actually look at those specific charges and verify in the text whether or not they're there. So that's some of the stuff that I think is interesting, is you can actually look at the text and still, whether or not you agree with it, you can disagree with it and say, well, but it wasn't racially motivated, or it wasn't that they were afraid of strangers, or it wasn't that they were just trying to do a big land grab. So that's some of my
spoiler alert for Sunday, but this won't be coming out till much later, so retroactive spoiler
Yeah,
alert.
Exactly.
Why don't we get into it? I'll let you set the
some of this.
stage.
Yeah, so the crisis a lot, especially if we're going to start talking about slaughter, which we might as well. The crisis there is...
Well, I just want to jump in for a minute here. Like, I think especially you don't want to get too caught up in the temporal nature of things, but like the day and age we live in, which is a phrase I hate, these things are very sensitive.
Sure.
People bring just the literal definition of prejudice. People bring a lot of things into these considerations that kind of don't have any business there.
Sure.
Because of current cultural tensions and tribalism and like legitimate criticisms with various other things that are outside of this that unfortunately in a number of ways do kind of align themselves with these things like on the surface. So there's a lot of outward current cultural things that we understand that people are bringing to this, but hopefully the goal with this conversation is not to solve everything, but to kind of present what we believe
shine
is
some light,
the biblical perspective on it.
And I think too, like to that point, what has made it a lot harder for anybody to really come and approach it with a gracious, kind of listening spirit is
an
the
openness,
fact,
like an open-mindedness, which we really ought to approach anything we're going to seriously consider with.
Right. And one of the reasons why that's hard is because of how abused the Old Testament has been by people groups who want to, basically
who do those three things, who do harbor those three things that use this as
well, they don't
justification.
And I think it's interesting because Peter talks about how people, the ignorant and unstable, twist Paul's writings as they do the rest of scriptures to their own destruction. And I really think that that's what's going on.
Which is very sobering.
Yeah.
Very
I think that's
sobering.
That's exactly what's going on, because he's like, hey, sometimes Paul is hard to understand, and so they end up twisting what he says. And I think that's what's going on in the Old Testament. Sometimes the Old Testament is hard to understand for obvious reasons, like the cultural separation
very
between
culturally
us
removed,
and the ancient Near East. That is going to make that a lot harder to understand for the average reader on face value.
I remember even when I was in high school and college, beginning to wade into ancient Near Eastern tradition and history and culture, and just having my mind blown. We both grew up in homes and in churches where the word was taught pretty well, clearly, expositionally, thoroughly. We didn't just camp out on one or two topics. Our pastors and our teachers and our elders went through all sorts of stuff.
Sure.
But when I actually started, I just remember my Old Testament intro classes in college, just kind of having my mind be blown. I'm like, oh wow, Jewish people of the first century just had a completely maybe not a completely different, but a completely unique and very enhanced perspective that is impossible to have. We don't essentially bring that to that nowadays.
Right.
We have to work to understand it.
Yeah. I think that's important to bring up right at the outset too, because so many things that I was reading and critics and stuff saying well, hey, if you just take a base reading of the text, this is what it says. Well, yeah, but that's the problem. There is no such thing as just a base reading of the text.
Yeah, you bring your modern, whether it's American or European, or you bring your modern Western 21st century perspective to this ancient Near Eastern text.
You bring a biased understanding, exactly. And you need to bring a bias. You will bring a bias. That's fine.
Yeah.
You just need to be aware of it and understand how to compensate it so that you can understand it like the original audience did. Otherwise, and that's assuming a normal hermeneutic, which I think most people would, on the base level, ascribe to. If I write you something, you want to understand what I was trying to say. But that's difficult to do with a text that's as old as the Old Testament is. So that's all to say that it makes it difficult, because there are people today, or not people today so much as there have been people throughout history who have twisted the Old Testament to make it say stuff, to make it support things like slavery, in antebellum South.
American slavery.
Yeah.
Which is a distinction that we should talk about before that.
Apartheid in South Africa, right, was supported by a lot of Dutch Reformed.
Nationalism.
Yeah. A lot of nationalism today is supported along those kind of lines, of people twist stuff. Colonialism in America, there's some ties there that you can point out. And, I think it's a thing for scholars to continue to point out influences and what people actually thought and how these things really connected. But I think it's undeniable that there have been people who twisted the scriptures and use and abuse them to support awful things. And so, yeah, it is tough then when probably some of our listeners today come to the Old Testament, or even come to this podcast, to really think of it because you do see a text in the way that its followers or its readers respond to it. And we would say that these people really didn't follow the text correctly, but that's just splitting hairs to some people, and I understand that. I get that. But I think at the end of the day, it is important to understand a text in its context. Otherwise, you really don't hear its voice. You hear other people's voices that are trying to make a text say what they want it to say. They're trying to twist the words of it. They're trying to, play the game that so many people in certain media things do nowadays, where you just take a soundbite and take it out of context and make it into whatever to support whatever you want. But I think in a culture that's really hungry for truth, which I really feel like that is our culture, we're a culture that is looking for compromise and looking for truth and looking for something where how can we come together around real data and explain things and think about things. That is what we can do with the Old Testament. We have a chance to do that.
100%. And I think that and I want to be gracious. We both want to be gracious here at the Substance. Like, we want to be compassionate and thoughtful and open, and like, we're really excited. I've talked to some people, potentially maybe have guests on the show. Like, our goal isn't to purely promote like a single point of view. Obviously we believe in truth, but like, the goal is to like openly consider legitimate points of view. Like, because our call as believers isn't to insulate ourselves with people who think the exact way we think. Like,
Yeah.
that's where a lot of the problems for a lot of these things begin with in the first place.
Yeah.
Like, we are to be the whole always reforming. Like, the idea is we want to be renewing our minds, like sharpening our understanding of the word. And like, I think a lot of the problems, especially if those three things have happened, because people have insulated themselves from the quote unquote outside and the other.
Yeah. So if you were looking at a copy of the scripture and you were thinking, okay, where do I go to find this text, these kind of texts that they're talking about? If you want to see one that talks about kind of wholesale slaughter of an entire town, men, women, and children, you can go to Deuteronomy 2.
And that's hard. We both have children. Like, hearing just the quote unquote base fact, if you read it as is, the slaughter of men, women, and children's a hard thing to swallow in our day and age.
Sure.
Like, if you or I went to another land and slaughtered the men, women, and children, people would be correct to say, hey, there's a problem with it.
What in the world is going on there? And so, it should raise flags, and it should be shocking in a sense. And that, in Deuteronomy 2, that happens. You see, basically Moses is telling the story to Israel about how they got to the point where they're at, which is about to take over Canaan. And he recounts that they took out these two other nations and just completely wiped them out. Interesting. There's actually a phrase there, devotion to destruction, you'll see in most
You want to, did I just miss, did you say the reference? Like, people want to kind of follow along for this part?
Yeah.
Because we do want to have some good show notes, but for in real time now, if we're going to walk through a couple particular texts. Also, side note, this isn't going to be a Bible study podcast, but for this discussion, I think it's important to say, hey, like, here's specifically what we're talking about.
Yeah, I think it's good to reference sources, right? And
100%.
So if our source is the text, we might as well reference what that is in the text. If you want a specific verse, which this is a freebie for the listeners, but most of the time I recommend taking an entire chapter as opposed to just one single verse, because it's way more difficult to take stuff out of context if you read an entire chapter than just to read a single verse. But if you want that single verse, here it is. This is Deuteronomy chapter 2, verse 34. And Moses is saying about this king Sihon. At that time, we seized all his cities. I'm reading out of the Net, which if you have a hard time understanding things in the Old Testament or a narrative in particular, I highly, highly recommend the Net Bible. We can talk at some other time about why, but just for now, just know that's a really good one. All right, back to the verse. At that time, we seized all his cities and put every one of them under divine judgment, including even the women and children. We left no survivors.
Pretty cut and dry there.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, it's it looks pretty rough, right? So what's going on here? And I think on one end of the spectrum, right, you have the killing at all. Like, why would the Lord institute death at all in any of these kind of things?
That, I think, and I know we've talked about this and kind of broadly going over what we're going to talk about. I don't know if you exactly put it that way before, but I think like that, you might want to re-say, I think that's the perfect question.
I think it's a good starting point for sure. Why,
because boiled down to its essence, like, again, I think here at the show, at the Substance, what we really want to do is think critically, get at the heart of things, and really like examine them critically. And I think that is probably the best question to kind of really launch this off without biasing it one way or the other. Like, that is the best objective question, I think.
I think there would be two. I would think, why death at all? Why would the Lord ever like sentence any human being to death at all in that way? And then second would be, why in that particular way? And I think there's answers to both. So let's start with that first one, though. Like you said, you think it's the quintessential question. I can't disagree with you there. Like, any human, like, why would the Lord say any human would need to be put to death?
Putting that to me, I mean,
Yeah.
because the
What'd you think?
wages of sin is death, like we learned in Sunday school.
Yeah, I mean, if you believe in the setup of the scriptures,
I mean, really, I guess the ultimate way back, Genesis
it's
1,
the curse.
God is. And part of God is God is holy.
Yeah.
God is holy, man is not. Man has fallen short.
Yeah, and I think you get to Genesis 3, which talks about the fall and talks about sin and the curse. And the thing is, too, like, if you believe that the Genesis 3 is in some way representative of what has actually happened, whether I'm not going to get into the whole creation debate at this point, because I think people on both sides of the spectrum there can agree
Quote
with
unquote
this.
faith perspective, there is even dissension among the faith communities about that.
Right, but I think,
Which, yeah, I'm not interested in getting into that right now.
but I think even across all that, people would believe that, like, Genesis 3
It's representative
describes
of
an
truth.
event in the curse, which actually explains not just any particular human death, but literally all human death as the curse, right? Like, the reason why death is in the world, Romans 5 says,
First Adam.
is because Adam sinned.
Yeah.
In a sense, not only is this Deuteronomy 2 example a death because of God's judgment on the world, but in a sense, every single death that has ever happened in human history is an example of God's judgment on the world, right?
100%. Yeah, death did not exist in Genesis before. I mean, everybody knows. I mean, maybe not quite as much now, but everybody knows Garden of Eden, the fruit, they ate the fruit.
Perfect. Yeah.
So before that, there was no death.
Yeah.
Of any, like, I mean, that's kind of hard to fathom because, like, we do live in a completely fallen world, but, like, none. No cellular death. That's unfathomable.
Yeah, it really is. Yeah, it doesn't make any
You
sense.
take scripture at its
Yeah.
face, which we do.
Yeah. So in a sense, you have that broader scope, which is
The perfect world was broken by sin.
and God judges sin with death. In Luke, I think it's Luke 13, Jesus even points out that natural disasters are a reminder. When you've got the modern news story of XYZ, this bad thing happened and a lot of people died. It's Luke 13.
Which also, sidebar, just in case for anybody listening, does that mean that the people who had the natural disaster levied upon them deserve that, them specifically, in a certain way?
Yeah, it's kind of funny because Luke 13, people put that exact question to Jesus.
Sorry, that was a really terrible
Yeah.
leading question, but just thinking about it, I want to fill this out as much for
I love
for our
that.
entire audience.
No, I love that. No, I think it's so crazy because, like, so much we think about that question, and I love that the Gospels record that exact question was put to Jesus.
They had that question immediately.
Yeah. And literally, this is what he says. He says no.
Where are we at?
So Luke 13, verses 1 through 5. You want me to just read that section?
Hit it.
There were some present on that occasion who told Jesus about the Galileans whose blood Pilate had mixed with their sacrifices. Jesus answered them, "Do you think these Galileans were worse sinners than all the other Galileans because they suffered these things?" So that's the question you just asked.
Yep.
So any of our listeners, basically they're
Which
asking,
again,
yeah.
And I also ask that to point out the shamefulness of some people who would claim faith, who use that exact thing for
and then
those,
say
again,
yes.
those first three things, like
Yes.
the hateful of the
So Pat
other
Robertson.
people. I mean, yes, I'm not at all against naming names, but like a lot of people who claim the name of Christ, who have a very
Yeah.
public platform, very publicly say these ridiculously unbiblical
I
and
know
like
his-
actually hateful things.
Yeah, his big one was he said that about Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. Yeah. So this is the question that's asked to Jesus, and what is Jesus'
Are they worse
answer?
because this happened
Yeah.
to them?
What's Jesus' answer? Verse 3. No. But listen, it goes further than that. So what's interesting is it wasn't like, no, it's okay, like they didn't deserve it. His answer isn't no, they didn't deserve it. His answer is no, they didn't deserve it any worse than you deserve it, which is actually kind of more ominous. He says, no, I tell you, but unless you repent, you will all perish as well. And then he gives his own example.
He
says,
cites another disaster.
yeah, he says, how about these 18 people who were killed when this, I think, a construction tower in this city in Israel fell on them? Do you think they were worse offenders than all the other people who lived in Jerusalem? So apparently there was a suburb in Jerusalem. There was a construction disaster and 18 people were killed.
Said, were they worse?
Were they worse than the other people around town?
The building fell on them and several people died. Were they worse?
Yeah, and he says the same thing again. Nope, but I am telling you that unless you repent, you'll all perish as well.
Taking that back to the essential, death is a result of sin. All people are under sin.
Yeah.
So this is emblematic of the big problem, not their particular problem in the areas these things are happening.
Now, did the God of the Old Testament think that way? Did the God of Deuteronomy, did he play along those lines? And the answer is yes. Because who died before Sihon's cities were destroyed in Deuteronomy 1? Who was killed? How about an entire generation of Israelites in the wilderness? For 40 years they wandered around because they sinned against God.
Yeah.
Because they were told, hey, go up in this land and take this land, and they're like, no, we're scared. And God was like, okay, well, because you rebelled against me and didn't trust me, I'm going to wipe you out. I'm going to wipe out everybody who was of military age. So basically it was at that point that they did that, it was anybody 20 years old and up.
Culpable in that indecision.
Yeah.
That's disobedience.
Yeah. And so if you want to talk about wholesale destruction in a sense, I mean, obviously it wasn't every man, woman, and child, but it was every man, woman, and child of a certain demographic. They weren't children. Every man and woman of a certain demographic, because that certain demographic was 20 years old and up, so that rules out child, I guess. But yeah, God did not reserve judgment for only those outside of Israel. And I think that even goes to your question about the morality of certain laws and stuff. Like, it just shows again, like, he was
not applying his severe law, which is admittedly severe.
Yes.
Prejudicedly.
Right.
Or with favor.
Yeah. It was the same thing. Like, hey, if you are faithless to God, like, this is a consequence.
And again, just to state it again, our position, the Orthodox position on this is because of God's faithfulness, that's the standard. The severities of these laws is because of the entire complete holiness of God.
Yeah.
And I don't expect people outside the faith to understand that. But we do need to understand that is the baseline of these things, not a modern, liberal, open, everybody's okay kind of interpretation.
Right. And I don't think it's either the interpretation of, well, was Israel basically like ancient colonizers? Were they just going in the land, kicking out the indigenous population? And I saw arguments along those lines. There's a number of problems with that argument. One would be the fact that the people that they drove out weren't even all indigenous. You had the Philistines, who are actually mentioned in Deuteronomy 2. They are likely the ones, verse 23 of Deuteronomy 2, called the Avites, who lived in settlements as far west as Gaza, Caphtorites who came from Crete. Yeah, so there was Avites who lived in the settlements west. The Caphtorites, this other people group, came in and destroyed them and settled down in their place. So even there you see that they were driving out people who themselves had driven out people before them. So it's not necessarily a colonizers and natives dynamic going on here.
Sure.
And some people are trying to make that argument.
We like to put our context, especially like America, as having a cultural reckoning with a lot of things right now.
As they should.
And we're 100%. I'm sure we're going to get into that in a number of episodes in the future. But we can't impose that context onto everything else just because we're like, oh, there are injustices that are fresh and that are top of mind right now, and they should be, and we should deal with them where they actually are in our context, but we should not be looking to...
Don't just read them into every other narrative.
100%.
Right. So then what was driving this? So
yes, we're about halfway through here.
Yeah.
Let's hit that.
So people talk about like, oh, it was racist. Problem is, I mean, read Deuteronomy. Like, tell me one time where any of it is like, find the people who look like this, or who have these racial characteristics, or who, because they look like this or do this thing, they have this kind of genetic issue, and so they're inferior to our race. You won't see that. There is no their race versus our race stuff that happens in Deuteronomy to motivate warfare, ever. It's all along religious lines the entire way.
And I think, because we got a couple other things to talk about, don't want to spend a lot of time on that, but I think that's worth kind of really emphasizing. It was about men's relationship with God, not men's relation and perception of each other on a surface level.
Yeah. And it's not to say that I think it's interesting because I don't think that they conceived of race the same way that we started to, 1700s, things like that. Now, I think there definitely was racism in the Old Testament. One of the really interesting cases of racism.
I think, though, that, like, we've gone back and forth and we've had
Mhm.
plenty of private conversations, and I'm excited to have some conversations on the podcast about the terminology and the appropriateness of various things regarding race. I think it might be a little bit more, and again, I hate being the grammar police, but I think maybe either prejudice or like I feel like the term racist is really loaded and misused a lot potentially. Like the idea of categorizing somebody as a thing because of an outward thing, not like pure racism. Maybe that's the same thing. Maybe I'm just being oversensitive here.
But
anyway, hit it. Sorry.
Well, what I will say is in Numbers chapter 12, there is a incident where Miriam, Moses' sister, basically like starts attacking him.
Sure.
And she's attacking him ultimately because of his leadership, but the avenue she uses to do that is because he's married to an Ethiopian woman.
Exactly. And that you saw prejudice for sure.
Yeah.
You saw like Jonah hated the Ninevites. Like prejudice is in the heart of man.
But I think that exact text is actually an argument for why, like, he wasn't trying to like preserve some sort of pure race. He wasn't trying to do like he himself was racially diverse and was criticized for it by other people in his family.
Okay.
The Lord upheld him. And so, like, why would we think that he's turning around and, like, just so obtuse? Not that people can't be that way, but, like, the indicators in the text kind of point us in a different direction. So,
understood.
Just some thoughts. I mean, just to take in all the data and not have such a narrow focus, a lens that only takes our side in.
And again, I mean, I could be wrong. I'm on Twitter's probably where I'm most active as far as social media. And, like, I mostly do it for fun. But, like, when you do see people trying to engage, especially Twitter's not a great place for it.
No.
Although I do enjoy quippiness, but don't want to be harsh and judgmental, but like I really think that if you want to do more than be kind of like snide and obnoxious, you really should read it. Like read. You don't have to. What I'm not saying also is that you need to read the entire Old Testament and commentaries and scholars and like have a fully formed view and positions on all the problem texts. But like, man, read some chapters. Maybe read a whole unit. Read the book of Deuteronomy.
Yeah, if you're going to read one thing in the Old Testament and so that you could understand the Old Testament, read Deuteronomy. And like, get somebody that you could ask some questions on.
Or if
like,
you're all jacked up on Leviticus, which I see a lot of people on Twitter and Facebook, read all of Leviticus front to back and read just some of what hopefully faithful biblical commentators say. Like, try to get a
what
picture.
You're reading too. Like, if you're going to read Leviticus, understand that what you are opening up is a priest's manual. Like, literally, like, hey, that's why it's called Leviticus. Like, here's a Levitical priest's manual for how to do his job. Like,
the Levites were the race of priests.
Yeah. So it's like, if you open that up, just know what you're getting. Like, if you just open something up and you think it's going to read like Ephesians or something, or like some sort of letter or a novel, you're going to be lost. At least, this is why I recommend Deuteronomy. At least if you read Deuteronomy, you get into narrative. And it's very sermonic. Actually, it is sermons.
No, but I'm talking about people who fancy themselves as though they've read a couple of laws in the Old Testament. And they're like, these are prejudiced, these are racist, these are homophobic, or these are misogynistic, or what have you. It's like I'm honestly open to having an actual discussion on the merits of those things, like with somebody that's like read it.
Yeah. Not just read that one law.
And
like,
and then
went to Wikipedia.
They bring all the modern like rage and like everybody's gotta agree with one another into that. Like that's not how to have like an honest critical. Like you wouldn't do that in college. I hope. I don't know. I don't know. I hear a lot of people complain about liberal colleges. I don't know, but like I really hope that like if you were actually trying to thoughtfully engage with something, you wouldn't read one sentence, bring all your baggage to it, and then be like, I got a lot to say after I read that one sentence.
Yeah. I think some of the other things that's tough about
Sorry,
that...
soapbox over on that one.
No, it's okay. I think because of modern critical scholarship when it comes to the Old Testament too, like I think most scholars that you would talk to like don't believe that the Old Testament like books like Leviticus, Deuteronomy were written by the same people. And so they almost have a chop it up approach anyway, like legitimized. the majority view of scholars out there is that the Bible, at least the majority of the Old Testament, especially the law, was written by a post-exilic community that was trying to find identity for themselves coming back to a land that they had
Yeah,
been
yikes.
brought out of. So obviously,
So that's
like,
kind of heady. You wanna fifth grade that for us?
well, basically, like the argument goes this way, like, hey, we can't find archaeological evidence for an ancient kingdom of Israel or for a Moses or for the Exodus or for any of these things, but we do have archaeological evidence that there was a people that got exiled into Babylon, right? So the Babylonian kingdom
Like
came
Daniel
over,
and on.
took over Israel and then assimilated them, and then eventually they actually got allowed back into their land. So you can imagine
So to form a
people,
national identity, they just made this stuff up, and it's like, here's our backstory
basically, and like maybe edited
for the audience
together.
who might not be familiar. Just
Yeah.
trying to.
Yeah,
Bird's
that's
eye view.
kind of the modern critical view of the Old Testament.
Which we do not share.
Yeah, I don't. And the reason why I don't is because I think the Bible, in a sense, is evidence for itself. And I think the only thing that we have as far as hard data around that time is archaeology. And the thing about digging in the dirt for stuff that has been left there for 3,000 years
Plus.
is that is a really bad data set to prove the non-existence of something. And that's really what you're going on, other than some other stuff. So anyway, that's probably a larger topic for a different time.
So you want to hit racism and nationalism?
Sure. So I mean, we've started talking already about that a little bit, and then it's just the fact that Israel was commanded to include other races if they had faith. Like if and you can look at I believe it's Exodus 12.
The provisions for the proselytes from other nations.
Exactly. If somebody wanted to come and keep Passover, which was kind of the celebration feast that God had taken Israel out of Egypt, they were to let people join them.
So God was not exclusively. We can say we believe he was
He included
not
people,
primarily in that everyone else was secondary, but he was primarily in the order of chronology. He was primarily the God of Israel.
Mhm.
And then the God of all people.
Yeah, well, he had chosen their nation, but I think it's really important that he said, like, hey, if you would believe these things, like, you can come in and join this nation. And so, to put it one way, like, you could say
all tongues and all nations.
he didn't set up for them quotas of how many people could immigrate into Israel from certain lands.
Spiritual Israel.
To the
yeah,
nation.
national Israel
There
too,
wasn't,
yeah.
I mean, for them, there wasn't really a difference.
That's true at that point.
So Exodus 12, 48, 49 talks about that. Also, Leviticus 19:33 talks about the way that they should treat foreigners, which was don't oppress them, like treat them well. Because one of the recurring refrains throughout the Old Testament, especially the first 5 books, is, hey, don't forget that you guys were foreigners in Egypt. Don't forget that you guys, and so you wanted to be treated a certain way when you were in that situation. So when other people are in that,
12:49, the summation I thought was very striking. There shall be one law for the native and for the stranger who sojourns among you.
Yeah.
Whether you are quote unquote inside or quote unquote outside.
Yeah.
Like you're one.
That is effectively an anti-discrimination law.
Yeah. Unity, gospel, if you want to call it from our perspective, gospel unity didn't start in Romans or Ephesians.
Right.
Gospel unity is in Exodus.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's non-discriminatory, right? Like it doesn't matter who who your dad is or any of that kind of stuff. Like if this is what you want to submit your life to, you're welcome. You're welcome in there. And I've got a slew of anti-oppression laws that I've written down. I'm not necessarily going to read them all off, but Exodus 22:21, 23:9, Leviticus 23:22.
They're not.
It goes on and
rare.
on. Yeah, the Old Testament's repeated emphasis is on don't oppress the foreigner. So, I think with that said, like so that's even in Deuteronomy. Like the same person writing Deuteronomy chapter 10, writing Deuteronomy chapter 2. Like this is the view of this isn't racially motivated. It's not militaristically motivated either, because even in Deuteronomy chapter 2, and I'm just going to sweep this one aside really quick because you can see even in Deuteronomy 2 that there's other nations that would be in their national interest to attack, who actually had
Okay,
threatened them.
militaristically.
Yeah.
Okay.
That they don't attack because God tells them not to. Namely, Moab and Edom. They're two nations that were on either side, north and south of them, and they, in a sense, like if they had just been being nationalistic, like even if they were being retaliatory, like even if Israel had been America in 2001, even like
Sure, I see.
like hey, like
that's a good analogy. Well, and that's also why it's reiterated. A lot of people come to it in the Gospels in the New Testament where people are going, oh yeah, like he's gonna like liberate us and wreck shop and like, do all this like geographical, like nation-based saving. He's gonna save us from our oppressors, but like that wasn't the plan.
Yeah.
That's never the plan.
And so even in Deuteronomy 2, God says like, hey, yeah, sure, you have the military ability probably to take out these nations, but don't.
The primary goal,
because
and not even the primary goal. Forget primary. The goal isn't geographical, temporal conquest.
Right.
That's never been the goal.
Yeah. And so
it shouldn't be. It's never been the true goal of the actual people of God.
Yeah.
And that's where you get into like, you got the Crusades and Christendom and a lot of things that have created a lot of problems.
Yeah. So getting back to this topic then, we've talked about what it's not for.
The Old Testament.
As far as the Old Testament, especially in Deuteronomy 2, the slaughter and that kind of stuff. We talked about what it's not for. Not racist. It's not for militaristic purposes, that kind of thing. But I could give you some observations maybe what it is for.
And also maybe for people who are of the faith that might be challenged or even have questions in their own mind, I think this part of when we were talking about preparing, I think this is of immense value. Like, so here at the Substance, we really want to like take God at his word and look at culture, look at all sorts of things and kind of like put it all together. So like, we're like, okay, here are some things to help you have confidence in the Old Testament.
Yeah.
But it's more than just, okay, this isn't an invalid document. It is a very valuable document. The New Testament, all of the New Testament was talking about Scripture, and it has lots of very high things to say. It's talking about this. So,
yeah,
what it is for.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting is this idea of devoting this people to destruction is not unique to Israel. We have ancient Near Eastern texts from the Hittites which mention it, and also in 2 Kings 19, the king of Assyria mentions it as well. It was something they understood to testify to the reality of a God. So in other words,
break it down a little bit, yeah.
So basically back then, like as a nation, you had a God that was like the patron of your nation. Like he was the one who protected your nation. And so if another nation came in with a different God and like completely destroyed you, like the whole point was like your God's not real.
Or if he is, he's
weaker than our God.
Yep.
And so the Assyrian king argues exactly that way in 2 Kings 19.
Yep.
And so God is actually using this because it's an effective communication strategy in a sense to the people in that time and place. They understood this language. They understood this mode of doing something. They understood what it implied. And it meant things to them. And we know it was an effective form of communication. Let me just break it down really quick to this. Because in Joshua 2, Rahab herself says, listen, I saw the way that you devoted to destruction these two nations. Therefore, I know that Yahweh is God. Like he's the real God. And so I submit to him. And there you have somebody who's not of Israel, who's from an outside race, who's a prostitute, who believes in God because of the destruction that Israel had wrought under God's command, and is then invited and welcomed into Israel as part of it.
A lot of the modern ears just bristled at all of that. But you're exactly right.
Yeah.
That's exactly it. 100%.
Yeah. And sure, I mean, you want to point out, well, does she really have a lot of choice? She was trying to save her own skin, blah, 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 blah. You can say what you will about it. She didn't have to choose to do that. She has other choices, right? She can try to run away. She can go to another town. She can whatever. She can do what every single other citizen of Jericho does. Try to fight them off or just think, you know what? They can't take down us where we're at. Like, we're stronger than that. But she says, no, like, I really believe in what God is doing, and so I'm going to take part in that. I'm going to hide your spies. I'm going to be, because I believe that your God is real.
And her faith, the initial seed of that was her seeing God acting through these means that in the modern day, some have, it's just harder to understand.
Yeah. And I think the other issue people have with it, just in kind of in closing on that issue, is not closing forever, but just closing what I'm going to say about it. And I'm sure this raises way more questions than it answers. And I'm actually kind of excited to hear some of those.
Feel free. We don't want to. We're working with various different formats. I would love to, once we get enough of maybe a certain theme, or maybe they don't even have to be the same theme. We're still trying to figure out some of the format of the show. I'd like to maybe answer a question or two at the end.
Love it.
Listener interaction is very important with us. We don't want to just be an echo chamber either. The whole point of this is to start thoughtful conversations and keep them going.
Yeah. So I know some people think along the lines of God has used as a curse on sin, death. All humans die. He used this, and this particular thing, and it had, salvific effects even for Rahab. Cool, that's good. But why in the world would God use an imperfect tool to do this? Like, why would he use sinners, killing sinners, as a tool of righteous judgment?
That's a very good question. I mean, I imagine, I'm putting myself out there. I've had a lot of conversations with a lot of people who I imagine to be believers, long-standing church folks being educated under good preaching and teaching. I imagine they'd probably have the same question. Again, I don't want to assume that everybody's already thought through these things.
Yeah. I don't necessarily have the answer for this, but I do have an idea as to something you could say about it.
The genre of answer, like the type of answer.
Because in the text, an interesting thing that happens is this people come to Joshua and they say, hey, like, we've heard about your God, like, we submit to him. Don't worry, we're not from nearby of the people that you're supposed to just all kill because, God has commanded you to. We're from really far away, and they fake like they're really far away. And what's interesting is the sinful tool of judgment doesn't take counsel from the Lord in that moment in Joshua 9. And had they taken counsel from the Lord, the implication is that they would have heard from the Lord that these people actually were from nearby. So they mess up, they sin. They don't pray, they don't take God into consideration, they just act. And because they act, they actually swear to them by Yahweh, like, in Yahweh's name we won't kill you, you will live. And then they find out that, nope, they're actually 3 days away. They're like right here. And they consider it a more morally binding thing to keep the oath they made in Yahweh's name, don't take the Lord's name in vain, than to kill these people.
Which is directly a command.
Right. Both are directly commands, but it's like, which one? We can't do both now because we made this promise. And they said, okay, because we made this promise, like, we have to keep this, or else, God's anger could be against us. And the thing is, the view of the providence of God that is set out even in Genesis chapter 50, this is all within God's plan. And so it wasn't just a slip-up that saved the Gibeonites. God saved the Gibeonites through using an imperfect tool to carry out judgment that would not carry out that judgment perfectly.
Which that could be another episode or episodes. That's one of the most interesting things I've thought of in the last several years, is like the sovereignty of God in using things outside of his moral will to accomplish his ultimate will.
Yeah. So I think it's mercy, honestly. And you can think of it like if he had used a perfect tool to carry out that judgment, then those people wholesale are just done.
Wiped out.
But because he uses an imperfect tool, you might even include spies that go hang out with a prostitute in that bucket. I don't know. But certainly the Gibeonites are in that. People live that wouldn't otherwise have lived. So just some ways to think through those things. And I'm sure I 100% guarantee that there are more questions that are being thought of right now that we're not thinking of and we'd love to hear. But those are some of the things that help me think through that. And just when you look at the text itself, sometimes it will paint a different picture than the majority view. And so I think it's important to hear it out on those things.
Agreed.
Man, there's so much more we could talk about as far as how in the world could God allow slavery in an Old Testament system. But I think we can,
because I mean, there are a lot of things going on that kind of touch that. And we covered the MacArthur one. Oh, that Moeller podcast that we just heard.
It's so good.
That might be a good podcast, or maybe even a small series to talk about some of the ripples of that.
Huge.
You want to kind of tease and talk about some of our plans coming up for the new year?
Yeah. So,
Sorry, I kicked that to you. That was probably more my department.
I mean, I'm
so-
usually pretty good at reading your mind.
We want a lot. We want to keep this again, like the name of the show. We want to keep this substantive, but also have fun with it.
Yeah.
Like we've known each other for forever. This really kind of spun out of. I in my head a while ago kind of want to start a podcast. There's a number of different things that I wanted to kind of talk about, and feel like I'll have an outlet here to talk about many of them. One of the things that I'm excited about, kind of wrangled you into, is doing and not like the hopefully.
Not the hopefully.
The poor man's like
hopelessness.
kind of Jesus juking everything in pop
Oh gosh,
culture.
no.
Don't want to do that, but substantively interacting with things in the culture that are of substance.
Yeah.
Not just doing like the God's Not Dead trilogy or something.
Yeah.
Like talking about things, art and stories and music and fiction and nonfiction, things in the culture that we find substantive and excellently done. We're excited. But so we have some of those. I think we're going to be recording in a week or two another, essentially a movie review, but hopefully talking about some themes just as well as commenting on the pieces itself.
Well, I think
interviews.
we definitely want to get some cool interviews on here.
Who do you know?
Yeah. Let us
Who do you know that is interesting that we could talk to? We would love to. We'd love to get connected.
Yeah, tell them they should come be on the substance.
The most interesting, thoughtful people you know.
And what movies do you want us to talk about?
Yeah, we have a working list right now. I don't think we're probably going to publish that, but we have a working list of I'm the movie guy in this relationship we have here. So
and I'm the non-movie guy.
Yeah, we should maybe talk about our year-end lists here in this batch, and I think Trevor's top 5 might be the five movies he's seen this year.
Yeah,
but hopefully we'll get him a little bit more cultured there.
Word.
Yeah, we got a couple good interviews in the pipeline with some people from a variety. We got some pastors, some professors, some rappers, some creators, people we like and are interested in, who are thoughtful people who have something to say.
Yeah, and don't all share necessarily this exact same perspective on that.
I know that several of them don't.
So we want to bring that and think about that and let that shape us.
Compassionate and open-minded and generous. We don't have all the answers. We want to make sure we're holding ourselves accountable to judging things by the truth of God's word, but very open.
And I think as we encounter like different people and have our own views challenged, like that sharpens us to see, what do I bring to the text?
Yeah, the goal,
what's really there.
And the goal at the end of the episodes, especially with people who don't come from faith backgrounds, when we have them on the show, the goal isn't for a complete agreement. That's not the goal.
No.
Socials?
Yeah, you can catch us on Twitter.
Yeah, at The Substance Pod. Follow us, tweet at us, DM us. We do have a Facebook page. We'd love to geek out. I think Facebook would be really good as far as a community. You can actually have threads. Yeah. I love Twitter. Twitter's a great way to share the substance, but I think Facebook might be a good place for discussions, questions. Maybe have a question list, topic suggestions.
You know what I like, Philip?
What's that?
A good old fashioned email.
Email?
Yeah.
Where can they email us, Trav?
You can email us and I'll read it. I guarantee it. thesubstancepod@gmail.com. That's the email address. thesubstancepod@gmail.com.
Listeners, you have the guarantee that Trevor will read it and the guarantee that I might. Also, finally, if you're very old-fashioned, which we love, and you want to get on the show, contact us directly.
With your landline.
We have a phone number. You could, in fact, do this on a landline. That is possible.
How are you listening to this podcast?
Dial up our number on, just have it. You put it down, you have to start at the beginning. So you can reach us at our landline. Or I don't have a script in front of me right now. You can reach us. Our phone number, our voicemail is 913-703-3888. Again, 913-703-3888. Leave us a voicemail. Ask us a question. We'd love to hear your voices, maybe even get you on the show. And I'm excited about listener interaction. The best podcasts, we're both big podcast listeners. I think the best podcasts that create a listening experience and a community are ones that engage with those listening. So we're interested in any feedback. Also, subscribe. We're going to try to be on as many platforms as are reasonable to keep up, but obviously the main ones, iTunes, it would mean the most to get our content out there, to subscribe, give us a star rating and a sentence or two on iTunes, right? You're the tech guy.
Yeah, man. If whatever you're listening to right now, typically
any podcast aggregator,
you can scroll right down and hit a star button. So go ahead. If we've earned those 5 stars, go ahead, punch those 5 stars for us.
But
if there's
also,
things that you don't like,
you can leave a review.
You can leave a review. You can also
no, don't leave a review if you don't like it. No, you can leave a review if you don't like it.
Well, what Philip is saying is, if you don't like it, why don't you just send us an email and let us know about it? We're not adverse to that criticism. We want to hear what we can do to improve the show for you. So, yeah, shoot that our way.
And if you're really creative and want to, showcase some of your work, we would love to kind of partner with people to kind of get some other things going with our show as well. Maybe kind of designs, whatnot.
Yeah.
Anything else?
Fan fiction.
I think it's a little bit early for that, but I'm not going to lie. The first ridiculous thing that catches on our podcast, I'm a little excited about.
Nice. All right. Well, that's all I've got for this episode. Phil?
Thanks for listening, everybody.
All right. Yeah, we'll catch you guys next time. We will be, well, I guess by the time you're hearing this, we're already live.
Yep. This will have launched. I was going to stop you, and I'm like, I mentioned, where's he going with
Where is this? Yeah, welcome everybody who's listening to this after we've launched on January 13th.
Let me tell you back when we did launch.
Yeah.
And you shared it on Twitter and Facebook with all your friends.
Wow. Yeah. Thank you. You guys are so great. Good. Dude, what am I saying right now?